Through the Bible in 60 minutes, we reach the central message of the Bible with Part 5, Promises Fulfilled, the good news about Jesus Christ. Here's David.
The job of announcing the new covenant was graciously given to Jeremiah, the prophet who had seen the devastating end of the old covenant in the destruction of Jerusalem. God told Jeremiah he would make a new covenant with his people. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. They will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. Notice the repetition, I will, I will, I will. This is down to God. The old covenant was a conditional covenant that came in Exodus, and that depended on the people keeping God's laws. The new covenant, God is doing everything that is required. But the people had a 400-year wait before the new covenant appeared. While the people of Israel when they were taken into exile, they were away from the temple, they were away from where they went to do sacrifices and to pray and to worship God. So they used to gather together to read the law and the other books that they had at that time of the Old Testament. They would worship and they would pray. And the Greek word for gathering is synagogue. And so when they met, it was called being in a synagogue. And a group of men led those, and they were called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees studied the law of Moses in particular, and they added lots of other regulations to it in order to help men and women know how to live right before God. Synagogues are very important in the New Testament. Jesus went to his local synagogue, and the people who took the good news of Jesus around the Roman Empire went to Jewish synagogues to talk to the Jews there. And the way they worshipped set a pattern for how the early church worshipped, in that they would read the word of God, and they would pray and they would worship together. At this time, there were lots of political upheavals. The Persian Empire was swept away by Alexander the Great, who at a young age came out and in 10 years conquered the Persian Empire and all of the known world. His aim was to bring Greek culture and Greek language to the world. And although he died at the age of 33, the generals that followed him were all Greek. And so the Greek language became the language of all of these different empires. The Old Testament scriptures were translated into Greek. And this Greek translation was used throughout synagogues throughout the empire. And the New Testament was written in Greek, and the New Testament writers quoted from that Greek translation. Politically, Israel was ruled by a number of different powers. It had 100 years of independence. And then the Roman Empire grew and Israel became part of the Roman Empire. And the Jews hated the Romans right from the beginning. They hated being under their oppression. But the Romans brought peace to the world at that time, the Pax Romana. They put in place a very efficient transport system with roads and sea lanes. And they brought a system of laws that brought peace to the place so that people could move freely around the empire. God was not quiet in the 400 years after the end of the Old Testament. He was setting the world stage for the arrival of the child promised through Isaiah. The account of Jesus' birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection is told in 4 Gospels. And the word gospel just means good news. The first Gospel is from Matthew. Matthew was one of Jesus' 12 disciples, his closest friends. And he was a tax collector, which is why you can see the paper there. He's used his tax collection paper. And he wrote his Gospel particularly for the Jews. And he uses the word fulfilled over 40 times as he explains how the Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus. The opening of his Gospel is like this. It says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." He then lists all of the generations from Abraham through David through to Jesus. This was packed with meaning for his Jewish audience. Jesus was a son of Abraham. Abraham in Genesis was made a promise, a covenant, that all the world would be blessed through him. And that was fulfilled ultimately through Jesus. David was promised that a king would reign on his throne forever. And although they didn't have physical kings there, they now had Jesus, who will become king forever. And it says Jesus the Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. In Hebrew, in Greek, it is the word Christ. And that comes from Daniel, a prophecy that a Messiah would come, a promised anointed one would come. The Pharisees had built up a whole list of Old Testament prophecies, brought together their picture of what the Messiah would be like and what he would do. Matthew says, Jesus, he is the Messiah. And Jesus was born of a virgin, and that was promised in Isaiah. And Matthew picks up on that and says, this is the child. He is the Emmanuel, God with us. The Gospel of Matthew includes some extended teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, which is some of the greatest moral teaching ever known. Someone wiser than Solomon was here. The second Gospel was by Mark. This was written for a Roman audience. That's supposed to be a Roman amphitheatre. And Mark explains Jewish customs for this audience who wouldn't understand them. And it's thought that Mark was a close companion of Peter, the leader of the 12 disciples, a very impulsive man. And that's reflected in Mark's Gospel, which just jumps from one scene to another over and over again. He starts his Gospel with a very clear statement, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. He recalls many miracles that Jesus did. He healed many people, whether they were blind or deaf or lame or had leprosy. He even raised people from the dead. He, like the other Gospels, records the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus fed 5,000 men and their families with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Someone greater than Elisha was here. The third Gospel is by Luke. Luke was a Greek doctor. He came to know Jesus many years after Jesus died and rose again. And he went and interviewed many eyewitnesses and put together a really careful, well-considered account, which is what we have here. He includes many parables, stories that Jesus told to illustrate truth, rather like the Proverbs, and has a moving illustration of God's love in the prodigal son. Jesus was the Son of Man. He stresses Jesus' humanity, and also many stories about women, in particular a story about Mary and the birth of Jesus. Without Luke, Christmas would be much poorer. The final Gospel of the 4 is John, who wrote much later. Like Matthew, he was one of the 12 who was very close to Jesus. He was a fisherman, hence the pictures of fish. And he walked and ate and went fishing with Jesus. He knew him as a man, but he opens with profound statements about Jesus being there in the beginning with God, the creator of the universe and the giver of life. This Jesus, who is God, came and became flesh and lived among us. John explains his purpose at the end of his Gospel. He says, he selected this account from much more material, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. All 4 Gospels are very clear about Jesus being a man and God. God has come to be with his people in a new relationship. The Gospel of John talks about Jesus being full of grace and truth. He expresses his grace in the tenderness with which he shows towards those he heals, the compassion for those who are on the outcast of society. But he's also stood up for truth, and he has sharp criticism and condemnation for the Pharisees, who put barriers in the way of people getting to know God. They were offended, and they didn't like the fact that he called himself a Messiah. That was blasphemous to them, and they decided he needed to be eliminated. They couldn't pass the death penalty themselves, so they went to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and persuaded him to crucify Jesus, a barbaric, horrific form of execution. But they didn't realise Jesus actually came to earth to die. He was the ultimate sacrifice. Adam and Eve learned that sin causes death. Moses in the law gave them laws about sacrifices. The people had to sacrifice animals as substitutes for their own death to deal with their sin. And these Old Testament sacrifices had to be repeated. But when Jesus was on the cross, he called out, "It is finished." He had completed all that needed to be done to bring the new covenant into being. If we come to God in humility, then he will forgive us because of the sacrifice that Jesus has made. Jesus' death was devastating to his disciples and his followers. They thought he was going to throw off Roman rule and become a warrior king. They didn't understand. They weren't prepared for it, even though Jesus had told them that he would have to die. So the account of him rising from the dead is extraordinary. It's very simple, but it's very clear that his disciples had no idea this was going to happen. They were not expecting it at all. Those who've studied it are convinced this is an accurate historic account. The Old Testament prophecies about Jesus were all fulfilled at this time. The new covenant that Jeremiah talked about was signed, sealed, and delivered by what Jesus did on the cross. And his resurrection brings hope of new life for the future.
If you are not sure where to start reading the Bible, then start with one of the Gospels and read the good news about Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching.